was at a parish meeting this past week, and it took place at about 4:30 on an afternoon. And one of the participants was responsible for getting supper for her family. And so before she left home, she told one person to peel the potatoes, and someone else was instructed to put the meatloaf in at the right time, and another person had the responsibility of preparing the other vegetables. And what she did was she prepared for a time when she would no longer be there. She would join them later, but she made remote preparations, if you will, for her absence at that moment. Teachers do that all the time. If they know they're going to miss a class, they take careful preparation to leave enough work for the substitute to come in to be able to carry on where the teacher has left off. If we stop and think about those very common human experiences, how we prepare sometimes in advance when we have responsibilities but are not going to be present, that helps us to understand the scriptures that the Church invites us to reflect upon during this 6th week of the Easter season. Coming up on Thursday of this week, we celebrate the Feast of the Ascension. And of course, the Ascension brings to a close the public ministry of Jesus. Recall back in the early part of Lent, we reflected upon the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan by John. Jesus goes off into the desert to prepare for his public ministry. And for 3 years, he preaches and teaches, and his life culminates in that holiest week of the year when Jesus is taken and crucified, dies on the cross. But then Easter Sunday, Jesus rises to new life, and then for the next 40 days appears to his disciples, proving that he's no longer dead, he's alive. And now he comes to the end of his time with his disciples. The Ascension is just a few days away. And so what Jesus is doing is preparing his disciples and preparing us, in a very real sense, 2,000 years later, for those times when Jesus will not be present to us in quite the same way that he was present to Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and all the other apostles and the early followers of Jesus. And so he's giving us instructions. Yesterday's gospel, Jesus reminds us that love is the cornerstone of his teaching, that if we love one another, we give evidence of our love for Jesus. And if we love one another, then God is part of our lives because God is love. He reminds us in the gospel today that he's going to send the advocate, the Spirit, the one who is going to come to us and to help us testify continually to the presence of Jesus in our lives. 10 days after the Ascension, we'll celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, the gift of the Holy Spirit to the Church. And that gift of the Holy Spirit is the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of wisdom that really guides us and directs us in all things. Over the course of his public ministry, Jesus taught many, many things. Perhaps the crystallization of all that he taught comes to us in the Sermon on the Mount, those beautiful Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are they who mourn. They will be comforted. In a very real sense, what Jesus lays out for us is really a blueprint for a happy life. In fact, that's one of the translations of the word blessed. Happy are the poor in spirit. Happy are those who mourn. They will be comforted. Happy are the peacemakers. In a very real sense, Jesus reveals to us that God's deepest desire is that you and I be happy. Happy today and happy in a world that is yet to come. And part of what the Beatitudes represent to us is the way in which Jesus gives us the architecture, the blueprint for the happy and fulfilling and rewarding life. And our challenge then today as we listen to the scriptures is to reflect upon the way in which the Spirit is alive and active in our lives. The Spirit enables us to testify to the presence of Jesus. It's the Spirit of wisdom that helps us make decisions. It's the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus dwelling within us that really guides us and directs us in all things. In a very beautiful way, the presence of the Holy Spirit in the life of the Church is our guarantor, if you will, that regardless of what happens, regardless of the difficulties and the obstacles that we may face, in the end all will be well. Not because we're so great or so talented or so clever, but rather because God is powerful and present in our lives. And the continuing challenge for us is to be in touch with the reality and the presence of Christ who dwells within us. Jesus forecasts in an almost eerie way that someday there will be people who will put you to death, and they will think they're doing a good thing by that. If we look at what's taking place in the rest of the world and how Christians are being persecuted today, there's kind of an eerie sense of foreshadowing in what Jesus says. Regardless of the difficulties that we may face, most of us will never face that kind of persecution, but we do face obstacles every day. Sometimes we're caught up in the desire to have more and more possessions. Sometimes we fall victim to the temptation to become sources of anxiety for other people. Sometimes we fail to understand that we never walk alone. And so today is an opportunity for us to remind ourselves that Jesus prepared us for those days when he would no longer be walking the face of the earth. And right now, those days are now. And right now, we're able to succeed and do all kinds of wonderful things because the presence of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, is alive and well in our lives. To the degree that we live life in a loving kind of way, to the degree that we become instruments of God's love and healing in each other's lives, to that same degree do we make God present in the world in which we live. We always, every day, ought to ask forgiveness for those who we have harmed. We have to tell them that we forgive them for the wrongs that they've done for us. We have to always be thankful to God and thankful for all that we have, and always remind everyone that we love them, that we invite them to be instruments of love just as we try to be instruments of love in each other's lives. All of that, I think, is part of the message that Jesus invites us to hear and to reflect upon as he prepared his disciples 2,000 years ago for the time he would no longer be with them, and the way in which he prepares us to continue to be his faith-filled and faithful disciples in the world in which we live. All that, I think, is food for thought as we celebrate Mass this morning on the feast of St. Athanasius.